Well, firstly, I'd like to say something about manifestos. Why do we have them, and how are they used? I can tell you how they're not used. There are very, very few people in this country who are diligently downloading a copy of each party's manifesto, reading each one from cover to cover while making copious notes, and then coming to a considered decision about which party they want to vote for. If that does happen, it doesn't happen very often, and I would suggest that the people doing it are perhaps not entirely normal. Or they're perhaps here today, so thank you for coming. Manifestos are important, however, for events like this, for us to get an idea of what it is the parties are thinking about, what it is they at least hope on some level to work towards, and for us and others to dissect, to discuss, and then in future to hold to account. We come into this election with the Conservatives leading on virtually every policy issue. And so when you look at the various different things like health, education, taxation, the economy, etc., etc., the Conservatives lead on everything with the exception of health and housing. Those two policy areas are the ones that Labour leads on, but even then, only just. And so the individual policies, yes, they play into people's perceptions of the parties and indeed of their voting intention, but they're not actually the be-all and end-all. The average person in the street, and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street, isn't paying a lot of attention to the minutiae of the detail, of the specifics. Instead, they're thinking about the broad stories, the narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves and each other about the parties. Which do we think can be effective? Who do we think we can trust? Who will be strong and perhaps stable? Who can be good for people like me, for the country, and so on and so forth. And the individual policies do feed into that, but actually manifestos for the voters are much like a restaurant. You go to a restaurant and you look at the outside and the menu hanging on the door. And yes, you might like some of the dishes on the set menu, you might dislike some others. But the point is that if the restaurant itself doesn't look so great, you're probably going to look for somewhere else to eat. And that's the way to think of manifestos. When it comes to the particular policies, though, in this election, the most popular, with 79% of the population thinking it's a good idea, comes from the Conservatives, increasing NHS spending by a minimum of $8 billion over the next 5 years. Generally speaking, you never lost votes in this country saying you were going to increase spending on the NHS. And so, similarly requiring non-EU migrants to pay more to use the NHS, 70% of people supporting that. Capping rents so they can only rise in line with inflation, popular one for Labour. Increasing the living wage to 60% of the median earnings, again Conservative. So popular policies there supported by a majority of the population. The other end of the scale, we have ruling out the European Union without a trade deal. Fewer than a third of people support that Labour policy. Reducing the voting age to 16. Under one in three adults, I should stress, from 18 upwards, support that Lib Dem policy. But the award for least popular manifesto pledge this time around goes to the Conservatives, with replacing free school lunches for all infants with free school breakfasts for all primary school children. 23%, fewer than a quarter of people thinking that's a good idea. So the individual policies, some are popular, some are unpopular. They're useful for us to look at, but people aren't really paying much attention. Casting a shadow over all of this, though, is of course Brexit, and the implications that Brexit will have both on public opinion about the various policy areas, the various parties, the politicians, but also these particular policies. That cloud is enormous. It's worth remembering that, yes, the country is still broadly divided down the middle, as it was at the time of the referendum last year. And so in our most recent polls, and we have consistently asked people if they thought it was right or wrong that we voted to leave the EU, the results are basically 50-50, ones don't knows are excluded. There has been a bit of switching, tiny bit of movement both ways. There's fluctuations as things go along, but generally speaking, that picture has not changed. However, when you ask people whether Britain is right or wrong to now go through with Brexit, you have a proportion of people, nearly half, who believe that it's right to go through with Brexit because that's what they support. you then have an additional significant proportion, around between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 people, who believe that even though they didn't support it, it is right the result of the referendum should be respected. And so that means you have between 2/3 and 3/4 of people believing that Brexit should occur, either because they support it or because they respect the result of the referendum. And so the interaction between those two different bits of public opinion data, I think, could have huge implications, not just for whether these policies are implemented, but indeed for politics in this country for many years to come. And then, of course, we have the question of austerity. We have the issue of an ageing population. We have the issue of cuts needing to be made, etc., etc., etc. Generally speaking, the public still seems to be on board with that. The concept that austerity needs to take place, that the books should be balanced, and indeed at least one of these manifestos was at least fully costed. And so that's still something that the public believe is important. And so how Brexit and how the austerity agenda, as I say, cast a shadow over these policies, over these manifestos, and over whatever government we produce out of this process will be an important thing to keep an eye on. Thank you.